Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for our Gardening for Songbirds and Butterflies workshop in celebration of Customer Service Week. Tonight's workshop is focused on learning how to put together a butterfly and songbird garden that can work for a small area in the ground, a raised planter, or in a container. My name is Socorro Pantaleon with Cucamonga Valley Water District, and I'm so happy to have this opportunity to host a virtual workshop for you. On this next slide, you can find my information, email, and phone number if you would like to contact me with any questions you might have regarding this workshop or any of our rebates and programs. Follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you want to post a photo of yourself participating in our workshop tonight on social media, please tag us, Cucamonga Valley Water District, at CVWD Water, and Chino Basin Conservation District at CVWCD. In celebration of Customer Service Week, 3 lucky participants who fill out the survey regarding this workshop will be placed in a drawing for the opportunity to win a high-efficiency toilet with installation provided by San Antonio Water Company. You can do this by by scanning the QR code on the screen, by also clicking on the link that I'll be providing throughout the workshop, or keeping an eye out for an email that will be sent out at the end of the workshop where you can fill out the survey. Winners will be announced on CVWD social media at 4 p.m. tomorrow, October 9th. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any questions you would like us to answer regarding rebates, our programs, or future workshops, please type your questions in the chat feature located on the bottom right of your screen. This presentation will be recorded and available for you to review by Monday afternoon. You can also view this workshop and past workshops by visiting cvwdwater.com/landscape workshops. Joining me tonight in the main star of the show is Scott Plainrock from Chino Basin Water Conservation District. Scott is the Conservation Programs Manager for the Chino Basin Water Conservation District and will be leading the workshop. He's a sustainable landscape advocate, educator, designer, and horticulturist, and is passionate about the multiple benefits of regionally adapted landscapes and land planning. Thank you so much, Scott, for all you'll be teaching us this evening. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Thank you very much, Socorro. As I get started, I'll tell you all just a little bit about the organization that I'm from and what we do. To the public, we call ourselves the Waterwise Community Center. As Socorro mentioned, our formal name is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. We are a special district, so similar to a school district or a fire district, though much smaller, focused on water conservation only and serving the western edge of San Bernardino County, including your service area. We don't provide water directly to any customers, but we work very closely with the local water providers like Cucamonga Valley Water District on water conservation. We've been around since 1949 when we were created by a public vote, and our bread and butter is putting water into the groundwater. We are named after the Chino Basin groundwater table, and we are basically here to protect that resource. And so that resource is really essential to life as we know it in our area. It provides about 60% of our water supply. It's a huge resource for Southern California, and it's a good chunk of the reason why, even though it might not feel like it to us, our water is actually much cheaper than it is in many other areas like Los Angeles. And so the main thing that we do and have done for many decades is percolating water. So we own and operate some large holes in the ground, which you might have noticed off the 10 freeway, that fill up with water periodically after storms and sometimes even during the summer, working with bringing in available imported water. And those are operated to clean water through natural processes and help recharge the groundwater basin. But we also believe that we need to be very conscious with how we use water on the demand side, not just add to the supply side. because there's not much point in putting water into the ground if we're just not going to use it wisely. And so we also are busy demonstrating the multiple benefits of water efficient landscapes in a public demonstration garden, currently, unfortunately, closed to the public, but we are working on getting that reopened related to COVID. And once we are back to normal operating procedures, we're open and free to the public 6 days a week at our headquarters facility in Montclair. And we do lots of education, everything from free online workshops like this to one-on-one programs, some of which I'll mention later, to fully curriculum integrated K through 12 education, working with many diverse groups and working on training the professional landscape industry as well. So Socorro already provided a great introduction to me. The only thing that I will add to that is that this topic that we're covering tonight is really one that I'm personally very passionate about. You'll see lots of pictures from my yard. Habitat gardening is the main thing that I choose to do at home. I find it extremely rewarding. And so one of my goals coming out of this presentation this evening is to hopefully get you inspired. And not everyone's going to want to turn over their whole yard to gardening for the local critters using native plants, but it's so easy to do a bit of it somewhere and so very rewarding. So with that, we are going to do just a couple more bits of housekeeping before we get into the content for this evening. Socorro already mentioned, I will be sharing with her the links to be able to download the slides of this presentation. There's some references that you might want, and then also the YouTube link as well. As we go through, please type questions as they come to you into the Q&A panel. So you'll see in your Zoom interface, you can press a button where it says Q&A and launch a little window. And so just type in any questions that you have as we go along, and I will stop periodically and answer those questions. And then for questions that I might not have time to get to as we go, or if there's something that happens to be more personal about your yard, I will stay at the end until all questions are answered. And then as we go as well, if you have a question about a program or just repeating maybe a website that I mentioned the name of or something like that, feel free to type that into the chat and either Socorro or I will get back to you about that there. So it works kind of the same way. It's just a different little window. And so the last thing I'm going to ask you all to do before we get going is to answer this brief poll. And so you can just click on one answer to each of them. It tells us a little bit about who is with us today and gives us some kind of numbers and metrics, which are essential to how we track these workshops and make sure that we are able to continue to offer them to the public. So if you can take just a couple of minutes to do that, some of you are completed already, then we will get going. So people are a little more than halfway done, about 2/3 done. We'll give it just another minute. Okay, thank you everybody who filled out the poll. We'll just quickly look at the results. First one is just to kind of get our numbers. For most of you though, it is your first time joining us for a program like this. Welcome. We do lots of programming throughout the year, both Cucamonga Valley and the Waterwise Community Center. So I encourage you to keep in touch, follow social media, and check out our newsletters to hear about everything that we are doing. Thank you for the cities. No surprise that most of you are Rancho Cucamonga. And a lot of you grow a few native plants, many of you not yet, and some of you grow many. So hopefully for those of you that grow a few, coming out of tonight, you'll have confidence to take on more and the inspiration. And for those of you not yet, you'll know where to start if you want to attract some birds and butterflies. The one last thing I will share with you for those of you who it is your first time is the easiest way to stay in touch with the Waterwise Community Center and all of our free programs is to sign up for just our once a month newsletter. And that's really easy to do. If you go to cvwcd.org/newsletter, and I'm typing that into the chat right now. Okay, so with that, we'll get going on the good stuff. And so what I want to do is start with just some very common pictures from my yard. Normally when I teach this topic, I will wander out in the morning and just take some pictures of whoever is hanging out in my yard that morning, because there is always something going on in my yard, because what we're going to talk about tonight is the way I choose to garden. However, this morning I walked out and it was our first kind of more cold, kind of more misty, overcast morning, and the birds slept in a little bit. So this is from the last time I taught this topic a couple of months ago, but still have all of these visitors in my yard every morning. It's quite extraordinary. So I step out and on that morning instantly saw goldfinches hanging out on the electrical wire. Goldfinches, the little yellow birds, are common in my yard, and oftentimes I'll see up to 25 at once feeding on seeds from different native plants and using our bird baths. And then heard a chirping, and this was our local mockingbird who lives oftentimes on wires as well, and also in one of the shrubs that we have nearby. And we'll hear his call and enjoy it all throughout the summer, especially during mating season. It's a constant companion. So more goldfinches, and then heard some squawking, and that was from the scrub jays hanging out in our oak tree. Scrub jays leave during part of the summer. They go up to the local mountains, and then in the late summer, they come back. And so we've had a couple. They stay with a mated pair. We've had a couple of these beautiful birds hanging out in our yard quite often since they returned. And then we had, oh my gosh, I am just blanking on the name of this guy. Little guy who flies all throughout the yard and cleans aphids and other pest insects off of lots of our other plants. So I grow a lot of vegetables at home too, and I'll often see this guy hanging out in the veggie garden. I can't believe I can't remember his name right now. I'm going to blurt out a bird name right in the middle of the presentation in a few minutes, and that'll be who it is. And then wandered over to another side of the yard where we have some native sages and enjoyed a hummingbird. We have hummingbirds as well as constant companions, and they're very territorial. So there's one hummingbird who lives in our yard all the time, and then other hummingbirds who are coming in for the flowers and then being chased off and kind of fighting amongst themselves. Sometimes they'll pair up during mating season as well. And then also enjoying birds looking through for the seeds to see which of the seeds on the sage has ripened enough to start eating. And then also in all of this, even though we're mostly talking about birds and butterflies this evening, you will also attract native bees and pollinators and help support that population, which is in need of support. And the cool thing about native bees is that they'll pollinate our fruit trees. They are essential for pollinating many of our native plants, but they don't sting. They really don't have an aggressive instinct like honeybees can have. So they're just an absolute pleasure to have around. And some of them are really, really cool looking. So that's just kind of an everyday morning in my yard. And if you garden in the style that we're going to talk about this evening, then that will be regular occurrence in your yard as well, whether you convert your whole yard to something like that and then enjoy it just kind of constantly all day, or just a small area or even a few containers and won't be as constant, but it really is. If you build it, if you plant it, they will come. So the first question that I like to ask is, why would we consider gardening for wildlife habitat or gardening for birds and butterflies? I mean, they're pretty, definitely. But for me, it also goes deeper because it's something that we can actually do. I like this quote from Douglas Talmay. He's one of the leading authors in this country right now about gardening at home for wildlife. And he writes, it is becoming increasingly clear that much of our wildlife will not be able to survive unless food, shelter, and nest sites can be found in suburban habitats. And I have it twice here as a typo, but it's a very important concept, so maybe it's worth repeating twice. There are so many environmental things that we just feel powerless about these days. And planting a backyard bee and butterfly habitat or bird and butterfly habitat is not going to solve all the environmental issues, but it's something we can do. And for many of us, we're not using a lot of those spaces already. So we can have a beautiful garden that can help provide some habitat, which for many species is actually still in decline. And in doing that, it gets us in touch with the wider world in a very real and direct way that is lacking in a lot of our lives and that we just don't get with the typical lawn and a couple of shrub roses kind of landscape. It's very interesting and educational. There's always things changing throughout the year. It's one of my favorite parts about this style of gardening is, I'm not going to say to be a good person, you need to rip out all your lawn. I just don't believe that. If you're using your lawn because you play fetch with your dog on it, or because you have a kid who's learning to walk or something like that, or your kids play on it, then that's a lawn that's worth the investment of resources. But a lot of people have either no use for their lawn and they don't use it, or they have way more lawn than they use. And when you have a lawn, whether you're doing the work yourself or whether you're paying somebody to do it, what you're trying to do is you're putting in all this work, all this energy, oftentimes this expense on the schedule where in the summer it's like every weekend, and you're trying to keep this static picture, this green flat plane. And that's not how the natural world wants to work. And so by embracing the style of gardening that we're talking about tonight, you're also embracing the seasons. And there's always something coming into bloom and always something going out of bloom. And different birds come throughout different times of the year. And so whether that's just for your own enjoyment or your kids or your grandkids, it really changes how you live on the little piece of land where you get to decide what happens. Beyond that, it is literally therapeutic. There has been research, published research done now talking about how interaction with nature or out of a window, just the view of nature literally can help people heal faster. It can reduce stress. It can improve concentration. And if any of you with us this evening are working from home right now, looking out of a window, when you do that, I can tell you I am doing the same thing most of the time these days. And looking out into a garden like you're going to see a picture of on the next page just adds so much to my day and lets me take a quick mental break. I see birds coming and going all throughout the day, and it gives my cat something interesting to look at. So this is a picture of the front yard that the desk that I'm sitting at right now looks out into in the early summer. And when you do that, it all creates a garden that you want to spend time in. You want to be out there with the birds, seeing who comes and who goes. And then sometimes when you're inside and you just catch them coming and going, the birds will be more active in the garden, depending on the species, when you're maybe inside looking out. But creating a garden that you want to spend time in makes the garden care more enjoyable. And if you want to be out there, you can be kind of doing a little bit of your pruning sometimes with a cup of coffee on the weekend in the morning, or with a glass of wine in the evening, although plastic glass so you don't break it in your garden. And it's just much more pleasurable than the day in, day out of like typical lawn care. And then in the spring and the fall, there might be some heavier cleanup, but the pacing is just much more enjoyable. And then on top of that, most of the plants are low or very low water. So most of these gardens, most of the plants we're going to talk about this evening only need water about once a month and only need to be touched for maintenance once to maybe twice a year. That's once per month after it's established. First year, it's probably going to be about once a week. And if you're in super rocky and gravelly Rancho Cucamonga soils, maybe it's about once every 3 weeks. But in general, you get so much more for investing so much less. So we can do something good for the planet that makes your property more beautiful and more enjoyable, saves a ton of water and resources. So to me, I'm not going to tell you have to plant all native plants to be a good person. But to me, when we're thinking about what are we going to do in our yards, I see this as a great kind of new default landscape. And then if you want your fruit trees or your vegetables or a lawn of a size that you're going to use, then go for that. So for me, I grow fruit trees and vegetables, some high water plants in as much space as I'm going to use them. And then the rest of my lawn, or the rest of my yard are California native plants that are good for habitat. It's not all or nothing, and you don't need to start from scratch. So we're going to provide some examples of that tonight. You can start a bit at a time and then add plants and other elements when it's best for you. So if you want to start with just one planter bed, that one kind of like 2 or 3 foot deep planter bed along the house where a lot of people don't know what to plant, you can do that. If you want to start with a mixed hedge of great habitat plants just along an edge of the property where you're just looking at a fence or a cinder block wall, you can start there. It really is doable. If you build it, they will come. So this is our backyard a little more than a year and a half ago now, December 2018. And you'll see here, one of the first things we did, there are no plants. This is right when we moved in. The yard had been trashed. We cleaned it out. We were able to leave just a couple of fruit trees. And first thing we did is we had a bird bath. It was kind of short, put it up on a cinder block and filled it. And already the birds were showing up. So many more birds than I thought, just because that one source of continuous fresh water, we would change the water every morning just from a hose, is something so valuable to birds and not commonly available. That alone will get you going. And so really the crux of all of this is taking on a little bit of a different approach and a different vision when gardening. And so what I'm going to call it is conventional gardening and ecological gardening. Conventional gardening maybe is lawn and roses, but might be bedding plants, might be other things. But conventional gardening in general is only concerned what the garden looks like. A garden is basically an outdoor decoration, and plants are ideally like sculptures. You want them to be beautiful in bloom and just static if you could. You would just freeze it basically in spring. It'd be like a magazine ad. And the space gets manipulated to keep it as close as possible to this very narrow vision of what it should be. And if something goes wrong, it's a frustration and you work to eliminate them. A lot of people, if an insect shows up, they get out some poisons and you want to just get it right back to the original idea. That's not a fun way to garden. You're always kind of going at war with this insect or this critter or something like that. When we're talking about gardening for birds and butterflies, I encourage you to look at it through the frame of ecological gardening. And in ecological gardening, you view every yard or garden as its own living ecosystem. And as a living ecosystem, you embrace the fact that there's a complex web of relationships between plants, animals, the microorganisms in the soil, the fungi and bacteria, most of which are actually helping us. And it's very complex in the soil, but we don't need to really understand it all. Just know that if we don't want to put too many poisons or fertilizers there because we want the natural processes to keep going. And rather than a controlling hand, we're kind of a steward of the landscape, even if we only have a small yard. We're kind of up in the mix. We're doing something. We're seeing how things respond. We're observing. And when you do that, especially with native plants, some of which will kind of set some seeds and come back a little bit in different places sometimes, unexpected and delightful and pretty beautiful things happen constantly, and you'll often end up with a more beautiful garden than you could ever plan. If there is a setback, then you kind of just reflect on it and think, well, what could you do differently? It's not about getting out the poison, because if you get out the poison, you're going to be killing insects, some of which are then the food of the birds you're trying to attract. So, if there's too many insects on a plant, aphids or something like that, I normally don't do anything more than get out a hose with a high pressure nozzle and just spray them off. And if you're gardening through this ecological framework, you're going to be having the critters that eat the insects. You're kind of having this balanced system. And it ends up being a much more beautiful and magical place than conventional gardens. And it's more fun and more interesting and easier to consider yourself successful. So that's the philosophical part. What might it look like? Well, it can look like a variety of different things. And again, it doesn't need to be your whole yard. So we're going to look at a few whole yard pictures right now, but you can start much smaller if you want to. So here's a couple of pictures from my backyard. To be most successful at this, things might look a little bit on the wilder side, because that's providing the cover and the different niches for your birds, for the caterpillars of the butterflies that need shelter so they're not eaten too quickly by too many birds. It's all about that balance. And that's easiest to achieve with this kind of looser, more organic look, if that's what you're into. It's not necessary, but it can be quite beautiful. Show some pictures from my front yard. If you've joined us for other classes, you may have seen some of these pictures before because I have a lot of them. I've been documenting the whole process, and so I use it to explain different principles of landscaping. But this is the front yard at about 6 months after planting everything from small 1-gallon plants. And this is a bird, butterfly, and pollinator focused front yard. Beautiful plants like California fuchsia attract hummingbirds. We have it certified as a wildlife habitat, which is a cool thing that you can do through the National Wildlife Federation. And you can get that. It's just a little form that you fill out. It's all self-certified. You don't need to provide proof or anything. That gives you some parameters and you, in different categories, some guidance. And if you're providing food, water, cover, and places for wildlife to raise young in urban areas, most often that's like birds or lizards or insects, then you can get certified. You get this cool little sign. And if you are going to have kind of a naturalistic front yard, which are becoming really much more accepted and valued in a lot of neighborhoods, but you can also provide this sign if you're the first person on your block to do that, that lets people know what exactly you're up to, which is quite nice. And so in the first year of this garden growing in, we start getting things like a hummingbird that basically lives every morning in our front yard, resting on different areas that it can perch and eating little gnats and other insects because they will feed on flowers for nectar, but they also, for a lot of their protein and other nutrients, need to eat some little bugs. The birds really do help provide that balance. And in fact, I have very, very few mosquitoes in my yard. We're careful about not having standing water, but very, very few mosquitoes in my yard compared to most places I've lived, because in this, which is the first house that my partner and I own, we've planted so much habitat. We have so many different little birds that eat insects that it really helps provide a balance. While I'm talking about that, somebody put a question in, said, if you have a bird bath, what about mosquitoes? Mosquitoes need 72 hours of standing water for their larvae to go through their life cycle. So if you had a bird bath that you neglected and left with standing water for that long at a time of year where it didn't evaporate over 3 days, then you absolutely would have mosquitoes. But the best practice with the bird bath is to just refresh the water every day, keeps the water nice and clean and fresh for the birds. And if you do that, you're never going to have mosquitoes in it. It's simply not enough time for them to go through their larval stage. And so this is the yard at about 6 months. Native deergrass, manzanitas. We'll talk about some of these individual plants later. That's about 13 months, so it's not a huge yard. Provides lots and lots of habitat. I look out into this yard and see all sorts of birds all the time and lots of beauty. And so things are still growing in. You can't see all of the design intent yet. This is going to be kind of a mixed hedge to provide some privacy to the main house and kind of has this inner courtyard, but this tree on the other side will grow up some, so it won't be too dense. And with working with native plants, you can balance in the design. It doesn't need to be completely wild. So this hedge, this is a California coffeeberry, has this nice kind of glossy evergreen leaf all throughout the season. And then we have some other stuff that's more seasonal color. So that's evergreen throughout the year as the backdrop to stuff that will kind of come and go into flower and then go out of flower. So much beauty that can be worked with. This is another example that I really like to show of a California native, lots of great bird and butterfly habitat front yard in the Pasadena area. Smaller front yard than the example from mine that I showed. And this is really, I like it because it's graphically somewhat simple. It is very naturalistic, but there's this kind of low hedge of this California buckwheat, and then sharp contrast with the white of the white sage. There's a California lilac or ceanothus here, a native coastal or bush sunflower, and then this nice gravel path that kind of provides a loop through the area. And so it attracts lots of birds. attracts butterflies. But in addition to that, in this pretty small front yard, this is on a side street, but really close to a main street. When this lot used to be a lawn, this house would have felt really kind of right there on the street. And so providing this also provides a lot more layers into the landscape, which structurally is really nice for the birds and for the caterpillars, but also just makes the landscape and even then the house when you're inside, especially if you have the windows open, a much more pleasurable place to be. And so before we get into plants and planting design, we're going to look at some key elements of doing this kind of gardening. And the first one, in addition to the plants, is water. Mentioned it, but this is where we're really going to get into it a little bit more, because all life needs water, and a clean and reliable source of water is hard to find in the suburbs or in an urban area. And it's also hilarious to watch birds bathe. So I have multiple bird baths at my house, and we're very careful with how we set them up to make sure that we have a great view of them from inside the house, because they'll come around, especially some of the bolder species like goldfinches will come around when we're outside, but they really get into it when we're inside. And sometimes we'll see like 6 birds in one bird bath all flapping around at the same time. And so thinking about, can you line it up where you get the perfect view? I don't know if you have a slider, for example, in your bedroom where you can see it from your bed if you spend time there, reading or something like that. If your kitchen sink or your stove, when you're at it, you have a view out into the backyard, you want to put it there. Anything like that, the room that your cats hang out in, anything like that. And they don't need to be super expensive. I'm really a big fan of just using, and most of our bird baths are just a saucer, like would go underneath a pot. Terracotta, if they're denser, Italian terracotta, work just fine. They're not the easiest to keep clean. I would recommend, even though they're a bit more expensive, going with the glazed colorful one, because those are just easier to scrub out and keep clean. Although with some elbow grease and a little bit of hydrogen peroxide, you can keep the terracotta ones clean. And we have goldfinches, especially this time of the year, every single day, pretty much all day, visiting our bird baths. All non-recirculating water for animals needs to be kept clean. If you're not the kind of person to keep it clean, then just skip this part of it, but it really is critical for providing that support for birds. So make sure you're locating it close enough to a hose. That's another good kind of location thing. It's best to clean it out daily. In addition to mosquitoes, birds have no decency and will poop in their own water. And so scrub them out. I just have in my shed a little scrub brush specifically for that purpose. And in general, you don't need to use chemicals. Sometimes we'll use a little bit of rubbing alcohol or hydrogen peroxide, and then give it a scrub. So those saucers are great, but generally don't put those directly on the ground. Birds are safer and they're more comfortable if you put them a little bit higher up. And it's really ideal, if you really want to get into it, to have a small variety of sizes and depths of those saucers, because different sizes of birds will prefer different sizes and depths. We have some bigger ones that crows and even hawks will come to, and then the goldfinches actually prefer the medium or smaller ones. And then if you, in some of those saucers, put some stones or sand or gravel, and put some water in them, that's ideal for butterflies or pollinators or other insects that wouldn't want to land in a whole saucer of water. They get kind of swept in and their wings would get wet. So they can land on a rock or on some barely wet sand or gravel and then drink from there. And so this is one of my favorite things to do, just to elevate things a little bit, is a log with a saucer on top of it. And if you have some structure to work with, bird baths are best, or if you plan for it, to be close to a small tree or a dense shrub or two, which gives the birds somewhere to flee to. So if a cat shows up all of a sudden, they feel like they know that they can get away to safety very quickly. It will help them, it will help keep them alive, but it will also help make them comfortable. So you'll get way more of them at your bird bath. Don't place them, if you can, in an area where cats can easily hide and pick them off. It's estimated that every day, 2 to 4 million birds are killed by cats in the US. In addition to that, if you can provide a source of moving, recirculating water, that's really going to kick things up a notch in terms of providing habitat for birds in your garden. This could be a simple, cheap hardware store pump submerged in a container or overflowing into a pre-made vault. And there's lots of information online, YouTube videos, things like that about how to do it. And depending on how much volume of water is moving, mosquitoes might be an issue here. If the thing is large enough, you can use mosquito fish, and you can get mosquito fish for free from our local West Valley Vector Control District. You can look them up online. They actually breed mosquito fish and will give them to you for free. And if it's too small for that, or that's not good, you can get these tablets at the hardware store called dunks, which have a little bacteria in it, which will prevent mosquitoes from completing their life cycle. And so this is my recirculating water feature. It's just a aluminum trough, something that you can get at Home Depot's actually had them sometimes lately, or Tractor Supply Company, and then a simple fountain pump. And then there's actually just an outdoor extension cord coming off the back and running through the mulch somewhere where we know we're not going to dig through it. We know exactly where it is. And then it connects to an outdoor outlet. We just have some milk crates in here holding up the plant pots, and those pots provide a little bit of shelter, and then some birds will land on the edge, gives them some levels to wade into. We also have a few rocks in here on top of some of the milk crates, and then mosquito fish. And, you know, this happens a few times where we'll be hearing all the birds in the morning, and then all of a sudden it'll get quiet, and we'll look outside, and hawks like to come and take a sip and just kind of cool off and hang out in this water feature every once in a while when we're there in the neighborhood. So you can see here, it is at where it was set up at the place I lived before the yard I've been showing you, and just the simple extension cord coming out the back. And you can do something like this smaller as well. So here's just a pot that was sealed at the bottom and isn't overflowing, but just has a small fountain just to provide some movement to the water. Or it could be fancier and kind of overflow the edges and be on top of a hollow vault that normally they have a screen mesh on top that can support the structure of the water feature, and then you fill it with gravel and it looks quite nice. Another key element is the structure of the landscape. If you have the room, if you don't have the room, then that's just fine. You can bring the birds and the butterflies with just the plants. But if you have the room, and you can sometimes even do this in a small planting bed, overlapping tiers of vegetation. So again, doesn't need to look quite this wild if that's not what you're into. But the idea of having, if there's room, tree, shrubs, ground covers, or just larger shrubs, smaller shrubs, maybe something scrambling on the ground underneath. We're going to look at different plants and different resources to learn about more plants. But having that mix really helps provide different levels for different birds. Some birds like to stay in shrubs and they don't spend much time on the ground. Some birds spend almost all their time on the ground. Some birds prefer to stay up in trees. So that really provides a whole host of different options, structural options, to bring the greatest diversity of birds. And so with less height, here's an example of California fuchsia, our native deer grass, which actually has seeds that the goldfinches love. Here's toyon right here, which will turn into a small tree. We have a hummingbird feeder over here up against the house. We have a couple of other native grasses, red buckwheat, wood chip mulch, and then a few branches kind of forming the edge of the planting bed. Those branches are important because over time, little insects, little beetles and things like that, sometimes native pollinators will make homes in there. And especially those little beetles and some of those things become food for birds. Sometimes people ask about termites. I can't promise termites won't show up. I can just tell you that I've never had a problem with it. But these branches would definitely be something that if you're in a wildfire zone, potentially right up against the wild area in Rancho Cucamonga, you would want to skip that. But for most of us in the suburbs, that's just fine and really adds on to habitat. And I even went so far as to labeling the spider webs. I'm not always the fastest or cleanest person to clean up the cobwebs that might show up in the entryway outside. However, hummingbirds actually harvest spider webs and use those as the netting to hold their nest together so the nest can expand as their chicks start to grow. So again, it's this whole ecosystem. And sometimes we'll actually see hummingbirds out there harvesting the spider webs. Cover is something that's pretty important. So that's related to the shrubs. But if you have a back corner or something, a rambling vine can be a really nice and easy way of doing that. So here is a towhee, which is normally a ground dwelling seed eating bird. And it's poking out from our growing in Rogers Red California grape, which turns bright red in the fall before it loses its leaves. The other bird, whose name I couldn't remember earlier, is a bush tit. Knew that would come back. And then places to perch. And so this is just one example. This was a concrete footing that we had dug out when we were removing an old fence, but then used it and flipped it upside down. And just anything that provides a little structure above a garden is a place that birds will sometimes perch there and look down to plan what they're doing. So here we have our towhee looking down, deciding where it's going to forage for seeds next. We have some sprinklers on risers, just sticking 2 feet out of the ground with the sprinkler on top. And black towhees, who are aerial acrobats that catch insects, love to perch on them all throughout the yard. It's one of their favorite places to be. And then some woody debris. So I briefly mentioned it, but some leaf litter, so not cleaning up all of your leaves too quickly or using them as mulch somewhere else in the yard, not putting them straight into the green bin. Branches, some logs, which could double as benches, or small brush piles, if you're not in a wildfire zone, can add so much habitat to the yard. So we basically have in one corner of the yard what looks like a firewood pile, but instead of burning it, we just leave it there, and there's tons of lizards in it and little insects, and we see birds going in and out of it all the time, probably getting some food. We know that we have native pollinators nesting in there, non-aggressive, solitary, really cool looking, non-stinging bees. So again, thinking of that whole system. And so if you want it to look not quite as wild, here's another example from our yard where we're using a branch, old branch as a piece of edging with some stepping stones and then a small pocket of planting. And a diverse covering on the ground. So mixing some areas that have wood chip mulch with some area that have gravel, some areas that have stone. And then if you're interested in going beyond just birds and butterflies, but also want to support pollinators, little areas of bare soil, because some pollinators nest in the ground as well. And so doing this creates a yard that looks nicer, it looks more interesting, it helps the plants really kind of blend in and feel at home, but it also literally amplifies the habitat value. Here's an example of a shady habitat garden. And so if you want to, you can make it artistic or sculptural, or you can just put it down. The best wood chip mulch in terms of doing this and building soil is from what I call mixed arborist trimmings. So it's essentially like what tree trimmers end up either grinding up or bringing somewhere to be ground up. Healthy trees, not diseased trees, but if there's a tree trimmer working in your neighborhood, you can literally ask them if they can dump some stuff as long as they're not taking out diseased trees. There's also a service if you're willing to get a whole truckload of chips, and it's free. So sometimes you don't totally have quality control. It's called chip drop. Or if you are able to transport the wood chips yourself or just doing a small area, Waterwise Community Center at our headquarters in Montclair, San Bernardino Street, near the Monte Vista exit of the 10. We actually have a free mulch and compost giveaway program that we just relaunched. So in our parking lot right now, literally there's a big pile of mulch and a big pile of compost, and it's free and you can come and get it. You just, at any time, you just use your own tools, load it up yourself, and we ask people to wear masks and stay 10 feet away from each other, and it's there for you. And so someone just typed in, for the wood pile, would you place it in the sun or the shade? Ideally, a little one in the sun, a little one in the shade, because different things will go in different areas. Right now, our main wood pile is in the sun and it's used very well. And then we do have some logs and some other things in the shade as well. But I like to kind of have as much diversity as possible. And so here, still growing in, but this is an area of our front yard that captures water coming off the roof. And you can see again, just a little bit of this diversity. And together this provides diverse food sources, shelter niches, and nesting materials as well, which is really important for birds and insects. which those insects are then food for birds, lizards, and other insects. And even the lizards are food for a lot of the hawks that we have in our area. Sometimes some of the smaller birds are food for the hawks as well, but that's just part of that whole process. And as an added bonus, having all this bird and lizard habitat helps with the pest insects as well. And so when you start to think about the plants that you would put into a system like this, plants can be chosen for different reasons. And so plants can be chosen to provide seeds or fruits, or even leaves or flowers with nectar and pollen. And they're going to support a diversity of birds, native bees, butterflies, and other interesting critters. And the cool thing about it is that the best plants for this can easily be selected to be perfectly adapted to our soils and our sites. So they're not going to require any fertilizers or pesticides and not much irrigation water. And this goes across all soil types. So if you're in that Rancho Cucamonga soil where it's mostly rock and more gravel than actual soil, a lot of the California native plants, if not most of the local native plants, are going to be just fine growing in that soil. We have an area in our park. Our facility literally was an old gravel pit operation where there's hardly any soil. It's just fill gravel that was piled up when they were cleaning up. And we have a great native plant planting there just growing in that gravel. Conversely, if you're in one of those pockets of Rancho Cucamonga where there's clay soil, there's a lot of native plants that are perfectly adapted to clay soil. And we'll share with you a resource in terms of how to figure that out and choose your plants. So when you're planning your nature sanctuary or your bird or butterfly garden, focus on the simple concept. To set yourself up for success, you want to put the right plant in the right place, which means you're going to want to do some research and make sure you understand the sun requirements, full sun, part shade, full shade, the water needs, high, medium, or very low. How big is that plant going to get over time? And with a lot of native plants, in a couple of years, it will get that big. Some of them grow a little slower. But if the thing says on the nursery tag it's going to be 6 feet wide, it's going to be 6 feet wide. So don't put it 2 feet away from a path and hope for the best. And then if there's information on the soil or drainage requirements, a lot of our native plants need, quote, well-drained soil. And so you want to make sure you have well-drained soil. For a quick guide on what does well-drained soil mean and how do you know if you have well-drained soil, I would refer you to, we have a free PDF publication that you can download. And in the chat, I'm going to type in the URL right now. It's called the California Native Garden Design Guide, specifically made by our agency for the Inland Empire area. And if you type in cvwcd.org/design guide, it will load right into your web browser and you can save it. It takes a few minutes to load sometimes. And that has walks you through how to do a drainage test, and based on those results, whether you can plant all the stuff intended for well-drained soil or if you should stick to clay soil plant lists. If you're starting with a small area, generally a sunny area will be most effective, but if you only have part shade or shade, go for that. For maximum impact, here's what you want to do. You want to do a little research and aim to have a diversity of species and plants in bloom. And if you're working with fruiting plants and fruit, for as much of the year as possible. If you provide nectar sources all throughout the year, that's going to keep butterflies around drinking that nectar. Caterpillars are very specific on the plants they'll grow on, but butterflies are more generalists and will go for a bunch of nectar sources. Someone mentioned that they can't see the link I just put in, and that's because I only sent it to the panelists, which are myself and Socorro. So thank you very much. I will retype that, cvwcd.org/design guide. And I retyped in that newsletter link, which must not have gone through earlier as well. And so as we're talking about diversity, one thing to reflect on is provide balance. If you are not someone who's now super excited and you're passionate about native plants and habitat and really want to you want plants and growing in your garden to be your hobby, then don't put in 100 different species. For most of us, even if you're passionate about it, don't put in 100 different species to start with. For most small and medium-sized yards, for people who just want to have a nice garden and attract some birds and butterflies and things like that, 15, maybe 20 if there's some full shade and some, or if there's some part shade and some sun, 15 to 20, and you can even have 12 or less species. Can still do the job. Just do your research and choose them well. And only put in 100 different species if that's specifically what you're going for. Additionally, especially for front yards, sticking to 15 or so species, some shrubs, maybe a tree, some smaller perennials, that's going to keep the look more coherent as well. So don't, in the front yard especially, don't do just one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that. It's a common mistake that I see first-time gardeners doing, and it is very difficult to keep things from looking like a chaotic jumble in a front yard if it's just one of this and one of that. If the wild look doesn't appeal to you, then you don't need to have that kind of wild naturalistic look. So here is a picture of a San Fernando Valley, but hot area of the San Fernando Valley, very similar to here, front yard, working mostly with native plants. And there's a lot more trimming involved to have this more kind of traditional look, but there's still a lot more habitat than the lawn it replaced. Realistically, you will have more habitat value for your butterflies and your birds if you do go a little bit with that wilder approach, but this is still going to bring in life and looks lovely if this is what you're more into. Since we're focused on bird and butterfly gardening and we're halfway through already, I'm not going to spend more time really talking about the planting design, the like, this looks good next to that, here's how to get a specific look, contrast, leaf color, things like that. If you are interested in more of that, and I would encourage you, if you're going to do a larger planting, more than a couple of beds, to learn about that some, we have an entire 3-hour California native plant garden design workshop, a recording from a live workshop we did on our YouTube page. If you go to cvwcd.org/YouTube, that'll bring you right to the playlist of all of our pre-recorded workshops. You'll find that design workshop, and then you'll also find an expanded 3-hour version of this workshop if you're interested in that. We also have lots of tutorials on things like how to set up an irrigation system for a garden like this. And also coming up in just a couple of weeks, and it'll be mentioned in our next newsletter if you sign up for that, or you can check out our website. We have an installation and establishment of California native gardens class as well. So if you're inspired by the design of this, but you're not sure how to actually plant and get the plants off to a good start, we have that workshop coming up quite soon. And then it's going to be a great time coming up around Thanksgiving through Christmas to be planting. So I would encourage you to check out that workshop as well. And we'll be posting that workshop after it's done, when we have the recording edited, to that URL that's on the screen right now. If you're interested in joining us live for that workshop coming up, I typed in the URL where you can see all of our upcoming workshops and register for free on Eventbrite. So one tip to really keep the habitat value for birds and butterflies going, especially for hummingbirds and butterflies that are looking for that nectar source, is to try to have flowers as much of the year as possible. And that's pretty easy to research. Fall and winter are when there tend to be less flowers. So if you have a wider garden where there's room for some things to spread, California goldenrod and California aster are two great fall blooming plants. They can be kind of aggressive. I grow them in my yard under and around my fruit trees because they like that extra water, and there's plenty of room for them to scramble around. And then in winter, really important for butterflies are the many manzanita plants have flowers in the winter, and butterflies really like them. A note on garden care. If you grew up gardening or grew up with roses or anything like that, you know this term deadheading. It basically means as soon as the flowers fade, you cut them off and then the plant will send out more flowers. And for a lot of plants, that's true, even some of our native plants. However, an important part of attracting birds and keeping birds in the garden is the seed that a lot of birds eat, especially a lot of our backyard bird species. So letting the seed develop is important. So what you need to do is you want to wait and you want to let those flowers fade and you want to wait till those flower clusters dry out and set some seeds. And you can even kind of shake them and you can hear the seeds when they're ready. Some of our garden visitors, like the goldfinches and the house finches, will prefer to eat the seeds out of the plants directly. And then some, like towhees and mourning doves and Aztec doves, are ground foragers. And so they will wait for the seeds to drop and then they'll go eat the seeds off the ground. So somebody just typed into the Q&A, how do I attract doves? Have seeds developing in your yard, whether it's from perennials or shrubs or annual wildflower seeds. And then, in addition to the ones that will naturally drop in place, eventually it will get to where you are going to trim things back, sometimes seasonally. So like right now, for the native sages, it's time to cut things back, cut back the old, what are now seed clusters, old flower clusters, because things are about to start having their fall growth. But when I cut them back, I'm going to leave those trimmings, layer them on the ground, just adding to the wood chip mulch layer. So normally after the first year or so in the garden, I don't have to bring in any more wood chip mulch because I'm using a lot of my own garden trimmings. And then maybe just wood chip mulch for the pathway areas in between the plants because I like to have that natural pathway look. And so those trimmings get laid on the ground, and then the seeds and the twigs will both be used by birds. Sometimes the twigs for nesting. Some little insects will set up shop in the twigs, and those will be insects, little gnats and things that will be food for the birds. And then the seeds themselves, the ground foragers like the towhees and the doves will use them. And I constantly this time of year have doves and towhees just all throughout the yard kind of walking around. Doves are hilarious. They're big, they're beautiful, they're dumb, and they're just always kind of walking around looking for seeds. So don't worry about being too neat. So this is extremely sloppy. You can't even really see, the plants are too young to really see the design. They've grown in some, but I wanted to show this. These are some annual wildflower seeds that we let get dry. And the reason why we let get dry is because those turn to bird feeders. And so in an area where Clarkias, which are an annual wildflower seed, you can purchase the seed locally. The easiest place to get them would be the Grow Native Nursery at the California Botanic Garden in Claremont. You can also get wildflower seeds online. Peaceful Valley Farm Supply, which the website is groworganic.com, is the address, sells some California native wildflower seed blends, so online or retail sources, but you can't just go to any random nursery. They won't have the native wildflower seeds. But Clarkia is a really, really important one for birds. They get beautiful pinkish or reddish, depending on the species, flowers, 3 to sometimes 4, even 5 feet tall. And then they dry out, and the finches love to eat the seeds off of them, and they'll climb to the very end, and they will bend down and they'll peck the seeds out of them, and they'll be swaying back and forth. Absolutely lovely. So I have one small section of my yard that's a just annual wildflower meadow, and then it dries out. And I've been gardening with native plants for a long time, and I've learned to see just even the physical beauty in these grays and tans and things like that. A lot of people just see kind of dried out, kind of weedy looking, but this is such an active area for the birds in our yard with some bird baths on the edge, and just so much seed is produced every year. Now, again, not something I would do if I was in a wildflower potential area there. Once things fade, you might be able to get some seeds to set, and then you're going to need to cut this down. But if you cut it down with a string trimmer, any of those seeds that have set can still be on the ground. If you have too much, you might need to rake up some. But even if you rake up the brush, by the time you do that, you'll have some seeds left on the ground. And so that's adding to that natural mulch layer. So we're going to talk a little bit about choosing and learning about plants. And so I've mentioned all these things about plants. So research the width, make sure if you have clay soil, it's good for clay soil, all that sort of things. I'm going to provide you with resources to do that, not just leave you on your own to figure it out for yourself. So the number one resource that we recommend for doing that sort of stuff is the Inland Valley Garden Planner. This is a website that my agency, the Waterwise Community Center, Chino Basin Water Conservation District, has set up specifically for people wanting to learn about the best plants to grow in the Inland Empire. Has detailed profiles of over 350 of what we consider the top plants to grow in this area for home gardens. It's most of the water-wise plants that you would be able to find in local nurseries. If you go to like a specialty native plant nursery, like the California Botanic Garden, they're going to have plenty of stuff that we don't have, but this is most of the common stuff. And even with the native plants, we have about 120 native plant profiles, and that's most of what I would recommend for the beginning gardener to try. We try to keep it to the easiest to grow, most useful, kind of most popular, most recommended species. So a few things that will help you out here. The first one, if you go here, and it's inlandvalleygardenplanner.org, you can see it here. If you just Google Inland Valley Garden Planner, you'll find it as well, is you can go to the garden styles section. And here for people who are just getting started, don't want to figure it out plant by plant, we have some pre-coordinated plant palettes for you. One of them, the first one, happens to be is a butterfly and songbird garden. So here, already selected for you, selected for this area, is our top list where we have a small tree, shrubs, some that are full sun, some that like part shade, perennial plants adapted to a variety of conditions. Talk a little bit about horticulture, the look of that combination of plants, and then the moisture needs, which gives also an irrigation schedule and graph of how much water it's going to need. It is in inches, which is different for most people than what they're used to. But then we also have further information in terms of how to figure out for your irrigation system, how long to water. And if you are also wondering what this all means, definitely you could check out our online recorded irrigation workshops. And we have some stuff on there that really gets into how to figure out those run times as well. Also, if you put in a native garden and you're trying to, or a water-wise garden, or even just your existing garden, if you don't know how to water it, we actually have a program for any of you who live in Cucamonga Valley Water District service area, where at no cost, we will send a team from our agency out to meet you at your yard, run every zone of your irrigation system, take a bunch of notes, look at your landscape type, identify any issues, breaks, things that need to be fixed, and then issue you a schedule based on your plants, your irrigation system, exactly how you should have your irrigation timer set up. And so you can go to cvwd.org and to the area for community members to find out about that program. It's the Landscape Evaluation and Efficiency Program. And just to let you know, right now, because of COVID, we are on hold for that program because we do go into people's garages and do stuff on their irrigation timer. We're currently assessing if there's a way that we can change our standard operating procedures to make sure it's safe for both the homeowners and our staff. But we are taking an active waiting list for that. So if you are interested and you submit through the website, your interest, we will get in touch with you and put you down on a list. So if you are going to be putting in a new garden like this, and you put an irrigation system on it, that is an option to help you figure out that irrigation. So that was kind of a side point, but might be useful. And then so with these lists, each of these plants then will have its own profile, where for each plant you get the description of the plant, the water needs, but also all of those factors that I told you to pay attention to. How high is it going to be? How wide is it going to be? Gives you things like the flower color, when it flowers, if you're trying to figure out those flowers throughout the year, the kind of soil. So this one, for example, is adapted to clay soil. And then exposure, which is related to sun. So this is not one that can take full sun, but you see it's morning sun, moderate shade, filtered or direct sunlight. And then also we'll give you any other additional kind of information. And then each of these plants have the maintenance needs as well. Most of them are low maintenance, but if you need to do some cutback once a year, for some of these plants, it's very important. Some of them need to be cut back in the spring. Some of them need to be cut back in the fall, because usually you'll want to cut them back right before they do their big growth spurt for the year. If you cut it back at the wrong time of year, it might not grow again for a while. And so that's if you go through the garden styles section. The real heart of it, though, is the plant finder, where you can put in something like, I want a California native low water plant. My area is going to be full sun, and I want it to be a butterfly plant. So instead of 350 plants, now you're down to 28. Some are trees, some are shrubs, some are perennials. You can start to look at it. And then, for example, if you want to say, well, I also happen to have clay soil, now you're down to 18, and you want it to fit in a small space because maybe you only have one planter. And so these are our top plants for that situation. Most of you probably won't have all of those factors all at once. So that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And then there's also some helpful lists from our favorite plants for inland gardens, overall, plants that are good for slopes. And then if you just want a list of native and non-native, but butterfly plants overall, we have that list. One other cool website that you might want to take a look at if you're going to get real into native plants is Calscape. It's calscape.org. That is a project put together by the nonprofit California Native Plant Society. And with that, you can do something pretty cool, which is just put in your address and you'll see all the plants native to that location. That can be a kind of overwhelming result, and not all of those plants are good garden plants. So if you want to get some kind of the best information, what I encourage beginning gardeners to do is go to the advanced search actually, and then you could do native to, I'll put it in 91763, which is the location of the Waterwise Community Center's demonstration garden. And then you can do also sun, water requirements, all that sort of stuff. But to make sure that it's plants that are nice and easy for beginning gardeners to grow, I tend to put very easy for ease of care. And then available in nurseries, commonly available, because sometimes they have some weird things in here that are hardly ever available. And then if you're, even trying to figure out flowering season, you can do all that sort of stuff too. And then whenever you have all your factors, you can hit search. And then this will bring up 80 plants that meet those requirements. And this is going to have some specialty cool California native stuff that goes beyond what we have in the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And for example, here's Chaparral clematis, cool vine, and then has information. One of the cool things that it really has, though, is very detailed information about which butterfly and moth caterpillars will use the foliage of the plant as the things that the caterpillars need to eat. Because one of the best things for supporting butterflies is making sure that you have the plants that the caterpillars like to eat. Some of them really are specialists and need very small selection of plants. So those are the top two choices for doing your plant research. And then in addition, I wanted to mention, there's a really cool YouTube channel called Landscape Integrity Films and Education, for the acronym LIFE, but if you just type in LIFE, it will not get you there. And this is all about native plants and habitat gardening, whole YouTube channel. And they have a lot of good stuff about butterflies, a lot of good stuff about those specific host plants that caterpillars need, about supporting birds in the garden. And they have a whole series of videos filmed in a really beautiful, quite large residential garden in Riverside. So whole video of stuff very appropriate to the Inland Empire area. And so what we're going to do just very quickly is we're going to look at some common birds and butterflies in Southern California, and then we'll finish by talking plants and design. I'm going to go through these birds quickly. However, all of these slides are going to be available for you as that reference that Socorro is going to send out the link to once it's up online. And so these slides, especially if you're already doing some bird or butterfly gardening, or if you're going to be starting to do it, then you can have these around, and then when things start showing up in your yard, these are going to be the most common things that you will find in your yard. So you can use this as a guide for identification. So we have our northern mockingbird, have a constant companion of a male mockingbird in our yard, and they will eat insects and berries. They'll hunt and feed on the ground, but also can swoop down to eat a bird. Not eat a bird, to eat an insect. American goldfinches, also very common. These are our seed eaters, and they are often in flocks. I'll often have 25 to 30 in my yard. They like to hang out we have room down the corner. We have one young oak tree, but it's still about 20 feet wide already. And I'll have a whole flock of them in there. They'll also hang out a lot on our utility lines and pick the seeds out of our plants and hang out a lot in the bird bath. Very social. And then there's lesser goldfinch, who is also around quite a bit, who looks very similar and acts the same way. And then house finch, which are a little bit bigger than the other two finches. They look quite different. Their body shape is very similar. They're a little bit bigger, and then they have that red, especially the males. And songbirds who are seed eaters are very, very social. And so you'll see both in foraging and eating the seeds and in the bird baths, all three of those species of finches will hang out together, which is kind of cool. Seasonally in our area, we'll sometimes get hooded orioles. We'll usually have orioles around in my yard for just a couple of weeks earlier in the year. And they'll fly through, and they like to eat insects, fruits and berries and nectar. Sometimes we'll try to get hummingbird feeders. They usually can't quite get inside. But yeah, anything that's sweet like that. So sometimes they'll go for salvia, the native sage flowers. They're medium sized. They're bigger than the finches. White-crowned sparrows spend their summers up in the mountains. And for me in my yard, that's how we know that it is kind of really fall is coming, the weather is changing. So we had our white-crowned sparrows just show up. It was probably at the beginning of this week or the end of last week in our yard. And now they are around. We'll see them on the ground quite a bit, eating seeds, and hang out in the bird bath as well. Towhee is around a lot of the year. These are a medium-sized bird. These are ground dwellers as well. We've already seen some pictures of them. And they are territorial, but pair up in couples. And so if you have a yard that's providing habitat, you'll likely end up with a couple of towhees, which will be your couple of towhees. And you might see them all the time if you have enough seed for them throughout the year. And yeah, they hang out. They'll leave for a little while, but they spend a lot of the year around. And hummingbirds. I really like hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are very common in this area. Anna's hummingbird is a year-round resident in our area. They are hilarious. They are tiny, super territorial, super aggressive. They will hang out sometimes in front of the window and almost taunt our cats. They are fearless. We have a hummingbird feeder. They will complain when we are changing the hummingbird feeder because they're waiting for their food, and they live off of nectar and small insects. And then seasonally, we'll also get the Allen's hummingbird as well. And you might get a hummingbird nest. So here you can see that nest woven together with the spider web. You can kind of barely see those strands if you look closely. And that's so the nest can be tiny when they're eggs, and it'll stretch as the little birds grow. This is my favorite style of hummingbird feeder. Hummingbird feeders are all sorts of different styles. Some of them are tall and narrow, but this is really my favorite style because it's the easiest to clean. And this is something that you can get definitely online easily, maybe at some local nurseries, but you must keep your hummingbirds feeders clean because it's sugar water, especially in the summer. It can mold very quickly, and then that's going to be really unhealthy for the birds. So if you're not the kind of person to be cleaning it regularly, don't use the feeders. They'll come around for the plants. Just put the plants that they like, and that's just fine. I am not fastidious enough to do something like keeping this clean responsibly. My partner Kira is. So if it wasn't for her, we wouldn't have hummingbird feeders, but they're great to have around. But you definitely want to get a style that's easy to clean. And then this also has a nice wide perch for them. It's just a really nice design. And they're not super expensive. I think this one's like $15. Bush tits are hilarious. They're tiny, they're very round. They travel in large groups as well. And you'll sometimes see like 20 of them fly into one bush, and they'll just be picking off the insects. Sometimes they eat seeds too, and then they'll all of a sudden fly out. They'll hang out in the same oak tree at the same time as the finches as well. If you have oaks in your area, you might get an oak titmouse. They're kind of look like the bush tits, but they're a bit bigger. They'll eat insects, nuts, and seeds. They'll actually eat acorns and smaller seeds. And they spend a lot of time in trees. And then you also likely, whether you have a native garden or not, sometimes have ravens or crows who are, I don't want to say bullies, but the garden kind of goes quiet when they come around. They can actually be aggressive with smaller birds. They can sometimes steal eggs, but they are genius birds. They are so smart and pretty interesting creatures. So a lot of people find them hard to tell apart if you're interested. And so this is a quick little guide that shows the differences. California or Western scrub jay is common as well. They'll eat acorns as well as insects and seeds. Black phoebe, this is another one who's around most of the year, and they are really acrobats. They can pretty much hover in place to pick off insects like hummingbirds, but just very different. You'll see them kind of do flips and things like that, and then they'll perch and they'll just stare out for their prey. They're almost like little hawks that feed on insects. And then house sparrow is the first one showing that's not a native bird, but they are just very common all around any kind of urban area. And if there's oaks around, you also might get an acorn woodpecker, who are really interesting to watch. They'll make perfectly fit holes for each of their acorns. Their call sounds like this very strange, eerie laugh. And sometimes they'll also be pecking holes and burying acorns in telephone poles. Mourning doves, we already talked about a little bit. They're seed eaters, mostly from the ground. They're very watchful, very skittish, have a really nice kind of pretty call, and sometimes will lay their eggs in all sorts of terrible places. And then the hawks. Sometimes we'll get red shoulder hawks or red tail hawks or Cooper's hawks. Sometimes they'll be moving through the yard fast, so they're kind of hard to tell apart. Birdhouses are something that you might consider. Birdhouses support a lot of our small birds who would normally, in kind of a natural situation, make their homes in the hollows of dead or dying trees. But in our backyards, we try not to have dead or dying trees that might fall over. And so providing a house for the kind of bird you're trying to attract can be a good way to go. You're going to want to do a little bit of research because the size of the hole matters. Bluebird houses are very common. I've tried having them sometimes. Sparrows have mostly nested in them. I've never successfully yet attracted a bluebird. I'm not sure if they would come to Rancho Cucamonga, possibly. I know people in Chino Hills will get them. But if you have one, and they're easy to find online, you want to get something that has properly sized hole for your bird, a roof overhang to keep moisture out, a vent for air, and then access, so like a little latch so you can get in and clean it out well between the seasons to make sure there's no parasites in there. Just scrub it out with some soap and water. And you want to put it in a safe location, not too close to where predators like raccoons can get into them, so far enough out on a branch or something like that. And so very quickly, I'm going to go through some of our common butterflies, and then we'll talk design. So monarchs are the very popular ones. If you want monarchs, you can plant our native narrowleaf milkweed, and you will have monarch butterflies, usually in the first season, almost definitely in the second season. It's amazing how quickly they find them. but narrowleaf milkweed at the end of the season looks pretty rough. For me, this is not a front yard plant. This is a backyard plant, and it likes a good bit of water. So for me, and it spreads aggressively. That's why it's called milkweed. So I like to put this under and around fruit trees where it will get that extra water, and it's somewhere that's kind of towards the edge of the yard and can do its thing. If you only have a small space, you want to be careful about planting this because it will take over. You'll have lots of butterflies, but won't be much to look at this time of year. Pale swallowtail. And so on this, as your reference as well, I have the hosts. These are the plants that the caterpillars will eat. And then we have on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, the entries for all of these plants. So you can read about them in the garden. Western giant swallowtail is not a native one, but it is one that you might have around because it likes citrus as its host plant. Cabbage whites, which are technically butterflies, and those will eat a lot of our winter garden veggies. But even the caterpillars are important bird food. California sister, which lives on our native coast live oak. Mourning cloak, which will live on our native willows, or Chinese elm, so it's around in the suburbs. Common buckeye, which likes plantain and monkey flower, a couple of native plants. And then the skippers, which are little and super territorial with each other and other insects. And sometimes I've even seen them chasing a hummingbird, and they live off of grasses. So our native bunch grasses are great for them. And then the blues, there's all sorts of little blue butterflies, and they like our native buckwheats, as well as the hair streaks. They also like our native mallows, which support a lot of different butterflies. And so see only a couple of questions that have come in. So I will keep going and then plenty of time for questions at the end. But we are going to look at design examples. And so for us to look at some design examples, what I wanted to do is provide 3 examples of easy places to start and just a few plants that are great for that. So we're going to use this layout of this, what would be a rather large front yard, and we'll look at different sections. So some people might take on a whole front yard, but we're going to look individual, some sections by sections, just to break it down in case you want to start smaller. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is this concept of the habitat hedge. This is something that I find is a great way to enter into habitat gardening for a lot of people, because a lot of people who might not be ready to do a whole yard project have a boundary of a yard, a planting bed along the edge of the yard, or have wanted to cover up a chain link or a block or a wood fence, or want some more privacy somewhere. And so you can take an area, I would say minimum 5 feet, 5 feet to 8 foot wide area, and plant a small selection, could just be 2, could just be 3, of native plants just grouped in rows, and then lightly just do some pruning a couple of times a year to keep it hedged, just with a hand pruners or a loppers. I wouldn't even get out the electric hedge trimmer or anything like that, to keep it from getting its full width and just kind of keep it into a loose natural hedge. And so I have 3 plants that are my favorite plants, all of them great for birds, 2 of them really good for butterflies as well. And here are the 3. First one is hollyleaf cherry. This is a California native. It's a true cherry. The cherry that's made is, technically we can eat it, but it doesn't taste very good. It's a very thin fruit and it has a big pit, but it's super important bird food. And then it also is a larval plant for a couple of species of butterflies, host moths as well. We might not see the moths, but moths mean caterpillars, and caterpillars are the most important food for baby birds. They need that protein. Baby birds need that high protein caterpillars in most cases. Very few native bird species can eat seeds already. And then it's also a great nectar plant for adult butterflies, including monarchs. And so it's kind of just green, but that makes a nice always green backdrop kind of hedge. And then it has these big clusters of cream colored flowers in the spring. And then the cherries later on in the year. Next plant to mix into that could be coyote brush. That is really important for pollinators and many beneficial insects and butterflies because it blooms late summer into fall, so later than a lot of other plants. Again, it's just kind of a green thing. It has almost like a foamy, very small flowers, but it's great for a backdrop. The seeds are a very important bird food. And then again, it hosts those moss species, so those caterpillars are other bird food. It has a dense structure, and it can be shaped to anything. So unpruned, it would be wider than it is tall, but it takes pruning very well, so you can keep it in a hedge-like form. But it has a density that's really great for bird cover and nesting, which is also why I consider one of the top habitat hedge plants. And then the final one, this is my favorite backdrop plant. It's California coffeeberry, and you can get them in different sizes. The normal, just plain old California coffeeberry, unpruned, would get 8 to 10, sometimes even 12 feet tall and wide, but it takes pruning. It's a couple of times a year to keep it basically whatever size you want. But you can also get some dwarf ones. So there's one, for example, called Eve Case coffeeberry. That one's only going to get 4.5 feet tall, and will get 6 to 8 feet wide, but again, you could prune it. So that dwarf one you can use as like a foundation plant underneath windows along a house. The tall one could be a full backdrop. The fruit and seeds are super important for birds, hosts butterflies as well, and again, has a dense structure. So in my front yard, the coyote brush honestly can be a little bit shaggy, in my opinion, for a front yard. So for me, super important to have in the backyard, and I'm planting one in my backyard this fall. In my front yard, I set up a habitat hedge to provide some privacy along one side, and it's a mixture of the hollyleaf cherry, 2 of those, followed by 5 of the coffee berries. So super simple, lots of habitat, and provides that nice evergreen backdrop for your plants in the front. So here's another picture of coffeeberry, just the foliage, the small flower, which beneficial insects like as well. And then it's called coffeeberry because we can't eat or make coffee out of the seeds. They're mildly toxic, like they wouldn't kill somebody, but they would make your stomach very upset. But the birds absolutely love them, super important bird food, and they change color as they ripen, eventually getting to this dark coffee color. Next, we're going to jump over to this small area. So this is an area, obviously in this example, that's like along this walkway up to the front yard. But these would be my top plants to mix and intermix together anywhere where you have either a full sun or a morning sun, afternoon shade, or can even be some morning shade and then like midday and afternoon sun area. This would work in an area that's 4 feet deep, 5 feet deep, could be deeper, but just basically planting bed. Oftentimes I'll see people who, like at the edge of their lawn, there's a planting bed and all the plants have died a while back. They haven't got quite around to replacing them. If that area is on a separate irrigation system from the lawn or is on no irrigation and just needs to be watered with a hose, these would be my top plants to start with for bird and butterfly gardening. So we're going to zoom in some here. And you can see in this example, there's little piles of rocks, there's some little logs and stumps as well. And so first one on the left is Margarita Bop Penstemon. This is one of my very favorite small plants. I have this in the corner where my driveway meets the front walkway. It gets lots of sun. It blooms from the spring, and if it's happy, through a significant part of the summer. And it has these really beautiful detailed flowers that are a purple to an almost iridescent blue. It's a very complex color that looks even better in person. It's hard to capture it in a photograph. Loved by hummingbirds and native bees, and hosts butterflies, including the buckeye and the checker spots. A lot of color, a lot of flower on a very small plant. Next to it, we have red buckwheat. This is another kind of most bang for the buck in terms of flowers. And it's nice to combine the buckwheats because the penstemons will bloom starting earlier in the spring into summer. The buckwheats will get going a little bit later in the summer and then sometimes go like all the way into the fall, or a few of them late in the fall. Buckwheat will go summer into early fall and has this kind of branched, very strange, almost alien looking flower structure. Flowers are used by many pollinators. They're loved by butterflies, adult butterflies, and then the birds will come and they will eat the seeds. And this one, if you let it also develop seed, This will lightly, in a nice way, spread around in your garden. Really easy to pull up, not super aggressive, but these plants aren't super long lived, maybe 3 years-ish on average, but it will normally kind of replace itself. So that's kind of nice. And a lot of butterfly species use it as a host plant as well. And again, when you have caterpillars, you have bird food as well. Next one is a native verbena. This is a small shrub or a large perennial. It's normally maybe about knee high, sometimes up to like mid thigh, normally about 4 feet wide, occasionally wider. But it's not a huge shrub. It's always small shrub. And the flowers of this are, I would consider them to be the #1 attractor of adult butterflies. See tons of different species. They love the nectar. It's also used by bees. Has a long flower season with a peak in spring going into early summer. It can go semi-dormant in the summer. Usually by this time of year, to be honest, it looks kind of sparse. But then when it cools off and we get our first rains, it comes back. So I have no problem using this in an upfront and center area because there's just always something coming into bloom, and it's okay if I have one thing that looks kind of sparse. I know it'll be coming back, but if that bothers you, you might skip this one or use it in the backyard. But if you're interested in attracting butterflies, I would absolutely recommend it. And then last one here is going to be hummingbird sage. This is a small sage. It's a perennial. It's not a shrub, and it slowly spreads in a really nice way. It'll fill in open spaces. And it's really easy to just pull out a chunk of it if it's starting to get somewhere where you don't want it. So it's not like a weed. The flowers are loved by hummingbirds. They're also used by bees. It flowers in spring and early summer, and then often flowers again in the fall. So some of the ones in my garden are just kind of getting going again, but with the main flowering in spring and early summer. And it smells incredible. This is one of my absolute favorite smells as well. So 4 simple plants that you can plant at home in a small planter area and get going. Have a lot of beauty, a lot of flower color for a lot of the year as well with this combination. And most of these, I wouldn't probably try the hummingbird sage in a pot, but the other 3 can all be grown in a pot as well, if that's what you have to work with. And then the final of these little kind of vignette examples is right here. This is a small informal meadow with some accents. So this would be in an area of a yard. You can also make it narrower and have it along the edge of a yard. Oftentimes I'll work with people where they'll have like the whole, everywhere around the edge of their lawn is a planter area. And they're wanting to redo that. Maybe they're going to reduce their lawn, or they're just leaving their lawn, but they have a long planter area. And they want to do something that's cohesive, not just kind of one of this and one of that kind of plant. So if you have an area that's 5 or 6 feet deep, ideally 6 feet for this kind of approach, you can do that kind of running long. Or if you have some space to fill, like in the middle of a front yard, this meadow approach works really well and provides some of that structure. And so the basis of this meadow is deer grass. It's a California native bunch grass. It's going to be about 4 feet wide, but with the flowers that are there year round, it's going to lay down another foot in each direction. So that'll be up to 6 feet wide. So you need to give it some space off of paths. If you plant it too close, it'll start blocking the paths. And if you have to cut back the flowers, it's not going to look right. And the flowers just stay these little narrow spikes. They catch the light really nicely. But because they're not a big flower that kind of dries up and falls apart, you just leave them on after they completely dry out. And then you just cut it back every 2 to 3 years to refresh it. And when the seeds develop, the goldfinches come in swarms and they love them and they're bouncing around in them. It's also a host for skipper caterpillars. And because it looks good year round, it's a nice base. And then in between, we'll put our larger flowering accents or shrubs. So one of my favorite is showy penstemon. This is a perennial, but it'll get up to 5 feet tall with these flower spikes that are gorgeous in the spring. They're loved by hummingbirds, and the birds will also come and eat the seeds as well. And they have hosts that are some of our butterflies as well. And then other kind of more shrubby accents that I'll mix into the background that look great, kind of poking up above the grasses, are any of these sages here, Allen Chickering, Poso Blue, or Worley Blue native sages, they're all hybrids that are of the same parent plant. So they're basically interchangeable. They're very almost impossible to tell apart. Loved by hummingbirds and native bees. Primarily flower in spring to early summer. The finches and the other seed-eating birds love them. And they smell so good. You can just clip like little bits of it and put it in your car, in a drawer or something like that. Smell amazing. And desert mallow, which is a beautiful orange flowered shrub. So you get a lot of different contrast. Has a long flowering season in the warm months. And if you cut it back, so there's one that if you do cut it back as it's finishing flowering, which I will do, this is one that I often won't let fully develop seed because it'll just keep blooming again. So as I'll let other plants develop seed, I'll get this one to rebloom. Many pollinators love it, and lots of butterfly species, at least 7 butterfly species will use it as a host plant. And the birds will eat the seeds when they do eventually develop. And so what I want to do now is you can see on here that there's some other trees and some other plants here. You can take a look at these as examples of how you might do other small areas if you download the PDF, but I want to keep going because at the end I have a list of some of my very favorite other habitat plants, and we'll see if we can get through some of that. We won't get through all of it before 8, but then you can look at the rest of the list as a reference for yourself and go from there. But what you'll notice is that you don't need a large area to do this necessarily, and you don't need to cram a bunch of different plants into each area. And in fact, if you do have a larger yard, you might think about it by taking it on in different sections. So you can keep the look kind of coherent. Again, sticking away from the one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that. So moving forward, also as a reference, if you download it, I included bird and butterfly plans as examples for full front yards, but you might find some inspiration in just how specific areas are used. And each of these have the size that each of the plants are. So you can use them as a guide to how large the space is. So we have small front yard, medium front yard, large, and extra large, all following this bird and butterfly theme. This is kind of a preview for a project that we are currently working on, which is a landscape design template project, which is going to provide along many different themes, guides for people in terms of examples of different sizes of yards, and then instructions on how to adapt those examples to create your own custom design for yourself. So if you're interested in that, if it sounds like a cool idea, we're still working on it. We have a lot more work to do, but then we're going to launch it with some really cool resources. So you can sign up for our newsletter and you will definitely hear about it when that is done. But so these are just kind of here as previews from that because we already had produced some of our bird's eye view examples for bird and butterfly gardens. And then something as Cucamonga Valley Water District customers that you qualify for is a residential landscape design assistance program that the Waterwise Community Center operates in coordination or in partnership with the Cucamonga Valley Water District and the Inland Empire Utilities Agency. And so essentially, if you participate in this program, if you're interested in redesigning a front yard or a backyard into a Waterwise garden, could be based on birds or butterflies, could be based on anything else, could include some birds and butterflies. I will actually work with you directly, one-on-one, to come up with a custom design for your front yard or backyard. This is an example of a design using a lot of native plants, that many of which are great bird and butterfly plants that I completed as part of the program last week. And so there's some specific information that you need to know about that program. The website is here, cbwcd.org/design assistance. It's a no-cost program, but we do require a $100 refundable deposit. If you install a Waterwise garden within a year of participating, you'll get a full refund check. You choose a design style ahead of time based on the styles that we have at the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. So one of those, for example, was that bird and butterfly garden. I'll give you specific instructions about how to take some measurements of your yard to send. You'll send photos of your site. I'll grab an aerial photo off of Google Earth. And then we do this remotely these days. So we'll schedule an online screen sharing meeting in which we will get going, get pretty far into the design of your yard. Then our staff will finish up the design and you will get that. If you're interested in doing the turf removal rebate program through Cucamonga Valley Water District, when you apply for that online, you need a landscape design for your area. And so we're very aware of all those requirements and can take them into account to do things like capture a little bit of the rainfall, put in the features that are needed, and the design that comes out of this can be used to qualify for that turf removal rebate. So some pictures as we transition, and we're going to talk about a few other key plants. A lot of you will not have room for a whole oak tree. If you have room for a large tree in your yard and you're interested in birds and butterflies and supporting habitat, I would highly encourage you to plant a coast live oak tree. Coast live oaks and willows, which require a lot of water, so aren't commonly grown in yards in Southern California, are the two most critical species for habitat. They're called ecological hub species because there are so many things that either live in them or off of them. There's many species of moths or butterflies, which we might not even see. Some of the moths are quite small, but their caterpillars will live on the oak leaves. And then the birds will eat the caterpillars, and it goes on and on and on. It starts this whole system. I can tell you that it's common for me to walk out into my backyard in the morning and there'll be 5 different species of songbirds in my oak tree. And it's just a wonderful thing. And then if they get spooked by something like a hawk or a crow coming, they'll go back into that oak tree. So they'll stay in my yard and then they'll come back from that oak tree. It really does a lot to provide a lot of habitat. And so about milkweed, I had mentioned, if you're interested in monarch butterflies and supporting them, that's going to be the easiest way to get them. Their caterpillars need to live on milkweed. They do not live on any other plant. And part of why the monarchs are having a tough time is habitat loss. Milkweed used to grow as weeds along the edges of agricultural fields all around the state. Well, there's a lot more herbicide use these days. Things are cleared of all the weeds and all that habitat is gone. Our backyards do help. In our local area, we have some monarchs that stay here year round and some that migrate. And especially for the ones that are migrating and might breed along the migratory path, having these things in our yards are important stopovers. So I mentioned, I like to have it in the bottom of my yard. So this is my young orchard area. You can see here, established fruit tree, here's some young fruit trees, and we have some habitat plants that are just going to grow to be underneath the fruit trees. Here is yarrow, really one of our top butterfly plants as well. And here is milkweed. This was one plant a year ago and has spread through this whole area. And we do get monarch butterfly chrysalises. So this is the caterpillar in its cocoon turning into a butterfly. You can even see the folded up wing. They're semi-transparent, so really cool to have around. They won't always make the chrysalis on the milkweed itself. So this is on a native grass nearby. But here is a section of it which we are constantly cutting back at our work. So taking over this whole area, trying to take over the path. This is at our demonstration garden. So we planted it in a back area near some fruit trees where it could do its thing because we wanted to provide the habitat, but it will take over. So if you plant it, anticipate that. You can rip it out if it comes out of areas, but I encourage you to put it somewhere where it can be kind of wild and spread. And if you have the space for it, I encourage you to plant it. So with that, we have about 15 minutes left. And if you have questions, definitely type them in and we'll talk some more about some top plants. First, I want to talk a little bit about annual wildflowers. So I had mentioned the wildflower mixes that you can get from either locally, Grow Native Nursery, or online from Peaceful Valley Farm Supply. California poppies are very easy to grow as well and very beautiful. And if you're interested in wildflower mixes, which are different species of seed that all come together, you toss them out together, and then it's kind of cool to play with because different years, different things will come up. The one that I've been most successful about or most successful with is there's one available online from Peaceful Valley Farm Supply called the Low Growing California Native Mix. They have a lot of great plants in there, including those Clarkias that the birds like so much. If you're interested in annual wildflowers, I would encourage you to start your first year planting them in a small area, either in their own bed, or if you have a mulched area in between other plants, you can do it there. If you plant them, you're going to want to plant them in an area where there's not a lot of weeds that come up every year, because it will be hard to know when things are small, what are weeds and what are your wildflowers. And then you'd have to pick the weeds out as they grow. And if you toss them out, it's perfect timing to just toss them out right before the first time it rains in the season. I'll sometimes literally be out there like the day before it rains, the clouds are coming in, tossing them out, and they will germinate on the surface, and that's fine too. If you have the ability to, if it's just an open soil or mulch area and you have a rake, you can rake them in just gently, just to barely cover them, not very deep. And that helps keep them a little bit more moist, and it helps keep the birds from eating as many of the seeds. Normally, even if the birds get some, there'll still be plenty of seeds left to germinate. And if we get at the beginning of the year a series of storms, if we're lucky, you might not need to water at all, but you might, to make sure you keep things going, need to just do a little bit of watering. It can just be by hand with like a hose, with something that breaks the stream of the water, or at least your thumb on the hose, but maybe once a week, just to kind of keep things from drying out too much. And then you can have success with wildflowers. But I also want to talk some about trees. If you have room to plant a patio tree, which is a small sized tree, then there are a couple of great choices that will really help bring the butterflies and the birds. First one is desert willow, which has these beautiful orchid-like flowers. And then the other one that I highly recommend is Desert Museum Palo Verde. This one is getting more and more popular. It has that beautiful green trunk and lots of yellow flowers. This one also does attract a ton of bees. So if you're allergic to bees, I might stay away from this one, but bees need habitat as well. So if you're okay with bees, this is a good one to consider. And then another one that can be a large shrub or a small tree is toyon, which is a super, super important food plant for birds and pollinator and butterfly plant. So it gets these big clusters in the spring of tiny white flowers that the butterflies quite like. Lots of beneficial insects like them as well. And then it has berries that slowly develop throughout the season. And it's sometimes called Christmas berry as well, because in November into December, these red berries ripen. And it's super important to birds because there's not a lot of other fresh fruit or berries for the berry eating birds in the garden that time of year. And so it will attract a lot of birds, and it has a handsome evergreen foliage as well. And it can take pruning. So for the large one, it's not the most attractive pruning job on this one that was done when it was little. I need to get a better picture, but you can, with some training, have a very nice form. And then for those of you who really, really want to support habitat, this is a great tree, blue elderberry or Mexican elderberry, local native. It's good for an area that gets a little bit more water, although it's very drought tolerant as well. But it goes summer deciduous, and it has a kind of rangy form. So this is one for kind of bottom of the backyard if you really want to do a habitat garden to support birds and butterflies as much as possible. Most people wouldn't want it in their front yard, but it is gorgeous when it is going strong. It has these huge clusters of white flowers that butterflies really like, and then develops these blueberries, which are super important to the birds. And again, if you have room, coast live oak is the large tree to plant. So we'll talk just a little bit about some large shrubs and accents. Toyon, I already mentioned. Redbud is a very, very beautiful large shrub, or you can prune it up to be a small multi-trunked tree, which is what I'm in the process of doing in my front yard. Does that in the spring. Absolutely gorgeous. And so the early flowers are used by lots of native bee species. And then later in the spring, they have these big clusters of seeds that are basically bird feeders. And then a couple other shrubs to mention. Manzanitas, most common and easy to grow one is one called Howard McMinn, have beautiful red trunks, and they have winter to very early spring blooms. So they're really important for hummingbirds and pollinators that time of year when there's not as much in bloom. And then the berries are later enjoyed by birds. If you're interested in hummingbirds, Baja fairy duster is in bloom almost year round in this area once it gets going after it's been in the ground for a year or two, and is absolutely adored by hummingbirds. Can take super hot areas. It's a native desert plant from the California desert. So that area where you get a ton of heat reflecting off of a wall that's facing south or west, or reflected heat off the driveway, can be great for that. We already talked about coyote brush and cherry and coffeeberry. Just kind of mentioning those in this list as some very important ones. Haven't talked much about shady areas. If you have shady areas, there's a number of plants on the Inland Valley Garden Planner that are referred to as Oregon grape. Different species, all related, and a large shrub that is a great habitat plant that grows in part shade or full shade. Spring flowers that the butterflies love, followed by berries that are eaten by birds, is Golden Abundance Oregon grape. And then there's also a normal plant, just called normal Oregon grape. And then there's a small one, low shrub, kind of knee high, called creeping Oregon grape. All have similar flowers, all have similar berries, all are great in this area in part shade or significant, almost full shade. All have evergreen, really nice looking foliage. And then the last of the large shrubs that I'll mention is ceanothus. Ceanothus are not the easiest plants to grow for beginning gardeners because people tend to overwater them, actually. And one other tip about ceanothus, if you're going to try to grow it, is that even though you might read online that they're for full sun, in inland areas like ourselves that have that really hot afternoon sun, they really are easier to grow in morning sun and afternoon shade. That's really going to be where you can keep them most alive. In full afternoon sun, when we have our high heat waves like we've had in the last few summers, we tend to lose them. So afternoon shade. Medium-sized one, concha. There's a bunch of different ceanothus. Concha is my favorite, tends to be easy to grow and does pretty well. Beautiful, beautiful dark blue flowers. And then Ray Hartman is a large one that among the ceanothus tend to be easier to grow. Sometimes people overwater them and can kill them. So that's why it's not the easiest. But they need enough water when they're young. However, could be worth a try because the early spring flowers are great for pollinators and butterflies, and they are larval host plants for many species of butterflies, and then also those moths with the caterpillars that support the birds. And so since we're getting to the end of the class, what I'm going to do is just kind of forward through. So as a reference, if you want to download the slides of the presentation, you can go through a similar list of medium and small shrubs and perennials, which have all those similar tips that include the wildlife value information, which is not always the easiest to find in other references online. So even though I knew we were not going to have time to get through all of them, wanted to provide them for you. And you'll be able to get the link from Socorro. But if any of you happen to be just watching this later on YouTube, I will also mention that you can download the PDF directly. It's going to be on a list of all of our past presentations at our website, cbwcd.org/presentations. And so with that, I'm going to advance really quickly towards our last few slides. A couple of other places where you can research plants and get good information online, in addition to Calscape and Valley Garden Planner that we mentioned already, are Tree of Life Nursery, Las Politas Nursery. There are a couple of California native specialty nurseries that have a lot of really great information. So to conclude, and then we're going to do a quick final poll and I'll go into answering questions. This class basically in one slide. Plant a variety of native plants of different sizes that bloom throughout the year. To support the birds, don't cut off the seed heads too soon. And when you finally do, leave them somewhere in the garden. Provide some source of water. Bird bath is just great. Don't be too clean if you can. Leave some branches and sticks and leaves and stuff around the yard. And if you're doing a broader area or even in a small planting bed, a mix of wood chip mulch and some gravel and stone is also great. And if you leave some bare soil, you also help support the pollinators in addition to the butterflies and the bees. And so with that, this will be our end slide. Just wanted to leave these website URLs up in case you needed to note any of them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch the closing poll. If you can please just take a moment to answer that. We'd really appreciate it. Lets us know how we're doing. And in addition to that, always love to get other comments from people in the chat. If there's some information that was particularly useful to you or inspiring to you, or if there's something that wasn't clear. We present this information in multiple workshops, so we're always trying to refine how we communicate it and make sure that we're doing a good job getting the best information we can out to people. So appreciate it if you can take a moment to fill this out. And with that, I'll start answering questions as well. Additionally, if you're interested in getting these plants, I will share both when I post it on our website. I'll also share with Socorro our list of local landscape suppliers, and it will include in the list of nurseries in that section what kind of plants they carry. And so you will get the list of our local nurseries that carry these native plants and these habitat plants that we mentioned in the workshop this evening. If you're looking for something specific, a lot of them will post their inventories online. You can always call them. Most of the plants we talked about are pretty common. Fall is the big shopping season, so you should be able to find most of them in the fall, but you can always check their inventory online or give them a call before you head out to the nursery. Some of them are also doing kind of alternate hours or different kind of, some of them are you put your order in ahead and they have it out for pickup due to COVID. So you also want to make sure to check the website if you're purchasing for this season, or give them a call to find out what the deal is. So I'll start answering questions, and if you have more, feel free to type them in. So from Disreen, we have tomato plants in our backyard and we get so many tomato hornworms. We have taken many off, but they keep coming back. What should we do about it? Well, a couple of different things. The first thing that is always my go-to, because I like to do kind of this ecosystem-based gardening, is the more plants you have for birds, the more birds there'll be around to eat small hornworms. And so that can provide some sense of balance. Realistically, if you have a ton of hornworms, that's not going to solve your problem right at the beginning. One thing that you can do is you can get in nurseries or online a bacteria called BT, which if you spray on your plants when the plants are young, kind of in the season when the hornworms are around, they need to get directly exposed to it. But that's a natural bacteria extract that can kill the worms. However, I will mention that I only use that as a last resort, even though it's non-toxic to humans and it's non-toxic to mammals, because in addition to caterpillars, it can be toxic for pollinators. And so you want to make sure that you're not going to be widely spraying it. and generally do it at a time of the day early before it's hot and the bees are out. But that and hand picking is the main thing I do. So at our house, we don't have many problems with it. We'll sometimes have some, but I think the birds eat a lot of them, and then we'll hand pick from there. From Cynthia, general question. Any advice growing plumeria, or is it a loss caused because we do get cold snaps? I mean, that's the thing with plumeria is they're frost sensitive. So it depends. In Rancho, it's really going to depend on your microclimate. Like down here, I live in Pomona, Montclair, there's some huge ones around because we get a little bit less frost, but you're going to want to find that warmest spot in your yard. If you really want to grow plumeria, warmest spot on your yard. Slopes tend to have more drainage of the cold air, so something a little bit of slope could help. And then sometimes putting just the little things, putting some rock or broken concrete around the base of it can soak up some of the warmth during the day in the winter and hold it in the evening. You can purchase frost cloth for plants online, and if you really want to grow the plumeria 1 or 2, it might be worth covering them up over the winter on the cold nights. And or you just might not want to bother. So it depends how much work you're going to put into it and how much potential you have on your site to find a frost or relatively frost-free area. From Sharon, I have lantana that keeps replanting itself. Is this good for butterflies? So in our area, I believe our native butterflies or our local butterflies, I don't think any of them, the caterpillars will use lantana as that larval host plant, but the adults do like lantana for the nectar. So it definitely is better than most plants at supporting butterflies because it does have that good nectar and good flower structure for the adults. From Jamie, I want to put a bird bath where a lot of kids will be, but I don't want the kids to get bitten by mosquitoes. Any suggestions? If you are taking care of your bird bath like you should be, you will categorically never ever get a single mosquito due to your bird bath, because you should be changing the water in that bird bath every morning. And it is impossible to get mosquitoes from doing that. Mosquitoes need 72 hours of standing water to breed, because what'll happen is that's the time that their larvae take to turn into an adult that flies around and can bite somebody. If you dip the water, tilt the water out of the bird bath and refill it, the larvae are very sensitive. They can't live past that, even if you just blast it with the hose and get most of the water out. But really, you should tip out all the water. I kind of flush some water through it, tip it out again, and then refill it. And really, just for the sanitary conditions of the birds, because they'll poop in their own water, you want to do that every morning. Have it in a convenient place where you can do that at most every other day, but I'd highly encourage you to do it every morning. And so it's just not going to be enough time for the mosquito to get through their life cycle for it to be any difference at all. Where you need to be more careful is if it's with a permanent water feature, even if there's some water circulation, that's where you might get into mosquito fish or the dunks. But in a bird bath, if you're doing the right thing, it just won't be an issue. If you're going to leave town, dump the water out of the bird bath and just leave it empty for a few days. And that's going to be the best thing. And yeah, so it really is not an issue if you're taking care of it. And so thank you everyone for filling out the evaluation. I really appreciate it. That is all of the questions. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And if you have any more questions, I will hang out as people leave. But Socorro, do you have anything else for us as we're wrapping up?
Yeah, thank you so much tonight, Scott, for hosting this workshop. We hope all of you gain some new knowledge and tips on creating a garden for songbirds and butterflies. Don't forget to submit the survey. It's in the chat box. An email was sent out as well. Again, this survey, you fill it out, you will be placed in a drawing for the opportunity to win a high efficiency toilet with installation provided by San Antonio Water Company. If you fill out the survey, we will be announcing tomorrow the winner at 4 p.m. on social media at CVWD Water. And again, this presentation will be recorded and available for you to review. I will be sending out an email on Monday. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to email us or give us a call. And we hope you had a wonderful night tonight.
All right, thank you very much, Socorro, for having me and for having the Waterwise Community Center partner with you to present this workshop. Thank you very much for spending your evening with us, everybody, and we hope to see you in future programs. Have a good rest of your evening.